Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about my favorite lower body lifts. And I will state up front that I know that not everyone has access to these things. I know that they may not have access to this specific equipment, but we don't tell people what we think is the best or our favorites are based upon the equipment that they have, because we could never do that, right? Because not everyone has access to everything, no matter what it is, and we all try to get the things that we know that we need, whether it's stuff you buy for a home gym or it's stuff that you look for in a gym. And what I would say to you guys is that if you live in a pretty big area with multiple serious gyms, is that you should be looking at what they have available. Okay, if you're going to go to a gym to train instead of building one at home, why in the world would you pay for a gym membership that doesn't have equipment you couldn't easily have in your house? In other words, if it doesn't have something better than what you could just have at home, I don't understand why you would even bother. You would just be better off building something in the corner of your house. So let's come over to what my favorite lifts are. Hip belt squat. Phenomenal for quads, adductors, glutes to some extent. Basically, the hip belt squat allows us to do a very wide stance type squat, and it puts our low back in traction. You know how you'll get people who will say silly stuff like, well, this machine takes stress off the back and lets me work my legs. Well, no, not really. Leg press puts a tremendous amount of stress on your low back. Also, a leg press is a pain in the butt to set up. Like, the hip belt squat destroys the leg press in every way possible from a recovery perspective, a setup perspective, and that's even considering the amount of work to set that up. And you start looking at how much weight you have to load onto a leg press slide to get any training response, especially if you're strong. It's a pain, and it can cause back issues. It puts your back into an awkward position, and you can strain your back and everything else, and people get hurt on the leg press. It allows for some positions that aren't normal, and you see people actually do get hurt on the leg press. It does happen. We've all seen memes of people snapping their leg and stuff on it. Okay. I'm not a big fan. Hack squat machines are okay. Plate loaded hack squat machines are not bad, but you still have axial loading and compression on the spine with a lot of weight. The hip belt squat allows us to perfectly replicate squats, get us into those wide stance squats, because that's where we build the most muscle. That's where we generate the most strength, is to take yourself eventually to the widest squat that you are capable of doing. Okay. Hip belt squat, by its very nature, tends to put us into wide stances, especially if you have to set it up with plates like that. So it's great for building that musculature up, for getting into a deep squat position with a wide stance. It puts your lower back into traction, and therefore is phenomenal in terms of recovery. In other words, you can do multiple sets of 20 on limit sets on that, and they're fatiguing, but they don't destroy you the way a back squat does, or anything else, to where your spine is loaded up, and it lets you focus on the lower body. Okay, because that's oftentimes why we're doing some supplemental leg work. If we wanted the extra weight on the back for everything that we did, we would just back squat. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with just back squatting to build a base. But when we start picking serious supplemental lifts, this is what we need to be looking at. Stimulus to fatigue ratio. It wins. It wins hands down. Up next, it's going to be the good morning. And you guys know how I feel about good mornings. You know why I feel the way that I feel about good mornings. They're an extremely versatile tool. Very high stimulus to fatigue ratio. Great for getting a stretch reflex in the hamstrings, building the erectors, building the T-spine, simulating the movement pattern of a conventional deadlift. We get movement pattern carryover, even though it's eccentric based instead of concentric based. Out of all the hip hinges, the Good Morning has, number one, the most versatility available, at least other than deadlifts off the floor. Right? Has an extreme amount of versatility available. Different bars where we can change it. We can change the strength curve very easily with it. Very high, but it has the highest stimulus to fatigue ratio pretty much of any hip hinge movement. And that matters, because what is it that we're always fighting? When we start talking about maximizing training volume or optimal training volumes, your limit is recovery. Well, if you have movements like that that are the easiest to recover from, because again, stimulus fatigue, we can do more training volume with them. More volume always produces more gains, more effective volume. The problem is in the context of only when you appropriately recover from it. That's the caveat. That's why we can't just do limitless volume. But with some of these movements, we can do very, very high volumes and recover from them. And the good morning is one of those. So again, we talk about, can we build the whole back up also to go with that squat? Well, there you go. I mean, that combination right there, those first two exercises, tremendous. Tremendous for that. Both of those put together would raise your squat and deadlift pretty quickly, because they hypertrophies all the muscles involved between those two, really. Then we get into the more specialized stuff. You have to have special equipment, really. It's going to be the glute ham raise. Why the glute ham raise? Because it has knee flexion. Okay, it is a big movement where we move our body through space. But unlike most of the hip hinges, it works the entire function of the hamstring. You have to remember, only 2 of the heads get fully recruited to the hamstring, or the 3 heads, when you do hip hinges. We need knee flexion to work all of it. And I'm not saying you won't build all 3 heads. We're just talking about maximizing development, because you're not activating all the functions, right? And I'm not saying it's necessary to activate all the functions of a muscle to make the whole muscle grow. Just some heads can end up being neglected. Well, it allows us to do that. It's a very difficult exercise to do. Very difficult exercise to do, but it's also, like some of these others, like the good morning, it's also versatile in that we can change our strength curves with it. Bands, change plates. Can do a lot with it. But it is, again, hands down, one of the best, if not the best, hamstring builder out there. And I'm not saying you can't build massive hams off a good morning, because you can. But it does bring another element to the table. And particularly, we start thinking in terms of injury prevention and building the hamstring down there around the knee. A lot of track and field athletes, the glute ham device is almost irreplaceable. And I would say the replacement would be if you do a bunch of good mornings and you have a leg curl machine, okay, fine. You can still get that function in, but the leg curl just isn't quite as good overall as the glute ham device. But, again, to come over to the point with enough volume, you could replicate the hypertrophy effects. So I don't want people to think that you have to have one of those, and I'm saying that it's a must-have device. And then finally, we'll come over to the reverse hyperextension, which I consider to be a must-have device. I'm going to say right now, if you have the budget for it, the first piece of specialty equipment you want in a home gym is going to be a reverse hyper. There is nothing that replicates it. And a lot of the people are like, well, I just set one up myself. It is not the same thing. You're not going to be able to put 300 pounds on the makeshift reverse hyper that you're doing and then have it swing and pull your legs under. You're doing something similar, and that's fine. That's better than nothing. We can definitely do some makeshift type reverse hypers, but the actual device is really irreplaceable. And I think particularly as you get to be older, and it's something some other lifters I know we've all talked about, that once you're a master's lifter, if you want to be a competitive strength athlete and you're over the age of 40, you have to get a reverse hyper. It really shouldn't be optional. You shouldn't even be, you need to go ahead and just throw in the towel. If you can't afford a reverse hyper at home or to have access to one, and you want to keep competing as a strength athlete past 40, unless you're the weird exception, the genetic freak, I would consider going ahead and just throwing in the towel at that point. Or you could just get the reverse hyper. And mainly because of the injury prevention, the back health. Then we get over to the point of the fact that it builds your erectors, glutes, hamstrings, everything. I haven't found anything that hits my glutes as hard as the reverse hyper. Okay, in terms of me actually being able to feel them. I don't feel them on anything. I feel them on that. And keep in mind, guys, I've done some pretty heavy hip thrusting and glute bridges and everything on camera. I don't need those anymore. I feel like the reverse hyper completely replaces any need for any of those things for me personally. Completely replaces them, makes them obsolete. But these are my 4 favorite exercises. These bring, in terms of overall development, stimulus to fatigue ratio, back health, injury prevention, everything else. These 4 movements are my current go-tos. They're my favorites. They bring a lot to the table, and that's the hip belt squat, the good morning, the glute ham raise, and the reverse hyperextension. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.